So you did a good thing. You grew cover crops beginning in fall, left them in place all winter long, and now that winter's over and the days are starting to warm up again, you're wondering what to do. Well, join me today as I show you how I manage my cover crops in spring. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and as I showed in a video last year, I started growing cover crops throughout my garden, particularly this bed where I grew a blend of different types of cover crops sown from seed in fall. Now, there are a number of different reasons why you should have cover crops throughout the year, but for me, a primary purpose is improving the soil. And so in this bed, I grew legumes and grasses and deep-rooted plants like daikon radish, all with an eye on improving the soil in this bed. Now, here in my Colorado Zone 5B garden, even though it's a wonderful, sunny, warm day, I'm still about 3 weeks away from my last frost date. And I'm at least 4 weeks away from putting the warm season plants like tomatoes and peppers in the ground. So this is an ideal time for me to start thinking about what to do with these cover crops. You want to start thinking about 3 to 6 weeks ahead of when you want to put those warm season plants in the ground to start dealing with these cover crop plants, if the intent is to improve the soil. Many of the plants that I put into this bed are annuals that died over the course of the winter. But there are also some of these grasses that have started to sprout as soon as the soil was warm enough for them to grow. And they'll continue growing. But I don't want a bed of cover crops. I want a garden bed that I can harvest. And so these plants have to die. Now this is a standard cycle when you do cover crops sown in fall with the intent to improve the soil. They're creating biomass, organic matter that I'm going to work into the soil. And that organic matter is going to feed the soil microbes and then provide nutrients to my plants. So even though it's painful to kill plants, I specifically grew these plants with the intent of killing them and working them into the soil. The types of cover crop plants that you grow and how you garden will influence how and when to deal with these plants. Now, if I were only growing the annuals like the peas and the radishes that were killed in my cold Colorado winter, it's easy. I just add that organic matter to the soil or allow it to stay on top as a mulch. But for these grasses like this winter rye, well, they can survive my winter, and that's when you have to think about killing the plants. One option that some gardeners use is to spray an herbicide over these plants like glyphosate to kill them and then use that organic matter as a mulch or to work into the soil. Now, I don't use those kind of chemicals, and I prefer not to bring herbicides into my garden. So for me, I use mechanical methods to chop and kill and then work this into the soil. My soil has only recently begun to thaw, and so these cover crops are still quite small and pretty easy to work with. If you have a milder winter or a shorter winter, your cover crops may be substantially taller and bigger than mine. It all depends on the type of plant you're growing to figure out the best way to work with it. And you'll have to do some of that research yourself. For some taller grasses, all you have to do is crimp the stalk. Just fold over those tall plants, and that's enough to begin the death of that plant. There are other grasses where that doesn't work as well. In fact, you need to wait until the plant flowers and then you can cut down the stalk, and that will effectively kill the plant. For me and these shorter plants, it will be much simpler. And so you can use this method and modify it to the size of your plants. An initial step that can help is to go ahead and cut the grass blades. Now this can also be done if you're growing cover crops throughout the year to keep them from taking over a bed. Just mow them down like you would a lawn. For beds that I'm about to turn over, I do the same thing, but I do it with my shovel, chopping the grass and the roots into smaller pieces. The chopping of the leaves and the roots may not be enough to kill these plants, but this next step usually is. And this is when I take a garden fork and turn all of this material back into the soil. All the organic matter that was on top is now incorporated a few inches down. A reason I like to use a garden fork rather than a spade or shovel is because it's less likely to disturb the soil life. It's usually not going to cut an earthworm in half. And so I can put the organic matter into the soil and disrupt it the least amount I can. I amended this bed with organic matter like compost before I sowed the cover crop seeds. And I also put a light mulch on it. So what I'm doing now in spring is just adding a boost of organic matter. And these plants are enough to accomplish that purpose. They're going to need a few weeks to break down and become usable for plants, which is where that 3 to 6 week head start comes into play. For the areas of my bed that I wasn't able to amend in the fall, I do things a little bit differently. I amended this bed pretty well last spring and then grew tomatoes throughout the entire season. Towards the end of the season, before my first frost date, I went ahead and sowed some of the cover crop seeds while the tomatoes were still alive. When the tomatoes died, the cover crops were already in place. So I just cut down the tomato plants and let these plants grow until the winter overtook them. Well, now I need to add additional organic matter to the soil because unlike the other one where I added compost in fall, this hasn't had that much organic matter for an entire year. Before I turn these plants in, I'm going to add compost to this bed. The compost, along with the cover crop, will give me a really big boost of organic matter. But this extra organic matter is going to take more time to decompose. So this is one of the beds that I'm not planning to put those warm season plants into for at least 5 weeks so that all this organic matter can begin breaking down with the soil microbes doing the job that they do. Now as I begin chopping the grasses and the light mulch and the legumes that have already died, the compost is beginning to incorporate and mix in with all of these plants that are being chopped up. And then like before, I take my garden fork and turn everything into the soil. This is also a good opportunity to see the health in your soil. I was actually surprised by the number of earthworms I uncovered. Another reason that we use cover crops is to protect the soil from the harmful effects of weather and the sun. So it doesn't make much sense to have grown these plants for as long as we have, turn them in, and then leave the soil bare for 3 to 6 weeks. Make sure you mulch right away after doing all this. Not only will it protect the soil organisms like those earthworms that are close to the surface, but if you use an old mulch like this one, these are the straw bales I used for my straw bale gardening, they're already beginning to decompose. And so by spreading a mulch like this on the soil, this straw, which has already started to break down, will continue to break down, not only protecting the soil, but adding more organic matter to it as well. Turning the soil like this aerates the soil, which is a good thing, adding extra oxygen into the soil that might have been compacted by winter snows. But it also dries out the soil. So to help get the straw to settle down and to rehydrate the soil, now it's time to water this bed pretty well. The soil microbes will love the extra water, as will the earthworms. And now, even though I'm not going to be planting in this bed for a number of weeks, I will treat it as though plants were growing in it. Because while the plants may not be here yet, that soil life depends on this water. So I'll keep it evenly moist to make sure that all this organic matter is breaking down like it should. There is a fair amount of physical labor involved, as you saw, but it really doesn't take a long time. I was able to finish this bed pretty quickly. You saw all the steps and you saw how fast it can go. The more beds you have, the more time it's going to take. How many cover crops you use is also going to be a factor. If your cover crop plants are closer together and more dense, it might take longer to chop and turn those particular plants. And don't be surprised if some of these plants start growing again. While this is pretty effective at killing most of the cover crops, some of them might sprout again. Just pull them out. We've already loosened up the soil, and the mulch is going to help keep any weeds at bay. So anything starts growing through this straw is a weed at this point and should come out very easily, and you just throw it to the top and it becomes extra mulch. And then the soil will be ready to go. A few weeks to come before the plants of my summer garden go in the ground, but they will definitely appreciate and benefit from this improved soil with the cover crops that I put in last autumn. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.